Good evening and welcome to Domination Submission Radio. I'm your host, Mike Mackay. I'm the host with the most DS, BDSM, kink, and fetish talk on Blog Talk Radio. We are going to have a great show for you tonight. We're talking about topping from the bottom. Topping from the bottom, and we'll tell you what that is if you're not familiar with it in just a moment. Let me tell you the phone number that you can use to call in and tell us what you think or ask your questions. The number is 347-857-1862. Again, 347-857-1862. You know you're going to call, so write that down. I'm going to proceed with a little shameless plug because this is a big week for me. The book, Domination Submission, the BDSM Relationship Handbook, has been released in paperback and Kindle formats this week, and it is now available on Amazon. So check it out. It is moving up in the charts pretty quickly. So get your copy and help me get into the top 10. All right, we do have a chat room at Blog Talk Radio. If you just scroll to the bottom of your screen, you should see it. And if you'd like to ask your question or make some comments or just make some friends in the chat room, it does require you to be logged in at Blog Talk Radio, and it's free, so check that out as well. I'd also invite you to check out our website. Our website is domination-submission.com. There you'll also see our links to Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and other social media. So I have with me tonight in the studio my co-host L.B. Shaw, who is the author of the Trust in Me series of erotic fiction. And I also have my special guest, regular guest these days, Lolita Sin, who's an up-and-coming fetish model. So how are you doing, L.B.?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm tired. I'm ready to move the show to Maui. How about you, Lolita?
Me too.
Hey, Lolly, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Probably a little bit better than you, given your crazy week, but...
Yeah, I haven't slept in days. I've forgotten what it's like. But hey, are you on board? If we move the show to Maui, you going with us?
Maybe. It is nice and sunny down there.
So our topic tonight is topping from the bottom. And I'm going to give Lolly the first shot at defining this for our listeners. Go for it, Lolly.
Fair enough. Well, topping from the bottom is essentially whatever you would think of a top, somebody who is normally in the more dominant role in one way or another. The bottom would essentially take over some aspect of that, usually unwillingly, on the top side. So essentially the bottom would be topping the other person from the bottom.
You want to jump in on this, LB?
Yeah, I think my understanding of it is that it's a submissive basically giving directives or telling the dominant or the top what she needs or what she wants, and it can be in very subtle ways or it can be in very outspoken ways, but yes.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to jump in and toss in my 2 cents. I believe that topping from the bottom is a phenomenon where what is apparent is not necessarily the case. You know, you have a dominant and you have a submissive in a relationship, and one assumes that the dominant is in charge, because that is kind of the definition of being a dominant. But what you end up with in reality here is a submissive who is actually pulling the strings, who is actually running the show subtly beneath the surface or behind the scenes. This is sort of a classic Wizard of Oz thing where it's actually the submissive behind the curtain, actually giving direction and training and orders to the dominant. Now, we're going to be talking about a lot of different questions regarding this issue, and it is an issue because this is one of those things that people will be arguing about forever in the lifestyle, and it's also very much misunderstood. But some of the questions that we're going to be talking about tonight are, first of all, the one we just answered, which is what is topping, but we're going to go into more depth, I think, on that. We're going to also talk about the role of a brat submissive in a DS relationship, particularly as it relates to topping from the bottom. You know, there are going to be some people who say that being a brat is not topping from the bottom, and there are others who will say that it is, so we're going to address that. We're going to ask the question, are there times when topping from the bottom actually works and works well for a relationship? And I think there's going to be a lot of disagreement there. When it doesn't work well for your relationship, what are the consequences? And the one I always like, the question I like is, can you be topping from the bottom? Can you be a submissive who is topping from the bottom and not know that you're doing it? Or conversely, can you be a top or a dominant and have this done to you and not realize that it's being done to you? So those are questions we're going to be talking about tonight. And, of course, we'll take your questions. If you want to call in, ask a question, or answer a question, or just make a comment, then the number is 347-857-1862. And we'll get you in the queue, and we'll do our darndest to get you on the air, because we love it when people call in. So I got a little clip that I want to play, and this, I think, is a great example of topping from the bottom. This is from a cartoon. I don't even remember what cartoon this is from, but it takes place around the breakfast table, a family, a father, a mother, and a teenage son at the breakfast table.
Well, these eggs are uninspired. Hey, Dad, pass the salt. Clearly can't reach that. I'm taking the leaf out of the table.
Don't take out the leaf, son. You're scratching the floor, son. It's not a one-man job, son.
Coming to you, Dad.
You better not, son. Oh, damn it, my only blue suit! I told you not to mess with the table! Now go to your room.
I do not approve of your methods!
Dan, must you spank him?
What? It's not a big deal. I don't even hit him that hard. Look, I'll show you.
Oh, my.
What do you mean, oh my? It's supposed to hurt.
No, it does. It does. But show me again how you do it.
What? I just swat his fanny, like this.
That can't be how hard you spank him.
Yeah, it is. It's exactly how hard I do it, just like this.
Oh, come on. No way. Oh, I don't believe you.
And that's how it happens. What do you think, LB?
Pretty funny. Pretty cute. That's
well,
exactly how it happens in my house.
I think it's human nature. It happens all the time around us. We don't realize sometimes that it's happening, but in normal vanilla relationships, it's not a big deal. Or is it?
Mm-hmm.
Lolly, what do you think?
I think it's very, very normal. You know, everybody has selfish tendencies, and we're all kind of looking out for ourselves for the most part. And in any situation, whether it's in a relationship or not, you're going to change the situation so it best suits you. And, I mean, that's kind of the definition of topping from the bottom right there.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, LB, about the fact that this is a bigger deal? This is much more of a game changer when we're talking about a DS relationship versus a vanilla relationship.
Well, I think that in a vanilla relationship, you're dealing with more of an egalitarian relationship where the couple they sort of naturally assume roles, but in a DS relationship, if you're topping from the bottom and obviously the dominant may not be aware of it or may not want that, then it's obviously going to cause some distress and some problems. I personally think it can be indicative of problem. Maybe the submissive is not happy. Maybe he or she isn't happy or isn't getting their needs met. So it can be an indicator of some deeper underlying problems. Sometimes, not always.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Lolly?
Yeah, definitely. I know we'll touch on this later, but I do think that topping from the bottom has its place as well, particularly when the bottom is more experienced than the top, and the top doesn't really know what to do. So I agree with LB. It's not always a cry for help necessarily. It just kind of depends on the context and to what end.
Mm-hmm. I think the real danger in this sort of dynamic is when you don't realize what's happening. Because I think we mentioned this in last week's show. We were talking about how a submissive can get it into her head that she's going to train her partner to become her dominant. And what you end up with is a submissive who is a switch, I guess is the best way to put it, or is diluting her role as a submissive, and then you have a dominant who is taking direction, so he's diluting his role as a dominant, so you end up with two switches instead of a submissive and a dominant, which is what you started out to create, is a classic DS relationship with a dominant as the head of the household. So yeah, it can get very, very complicated, and I tend to believe that the real danger is when you don't realize what's happening, when you are the person doing it and you don't even realize that you're doing it, or you happen to be the dominant and you don't realize what's going on. And what's crazy is sometimes everyone else can see it except the people involved. Have either of you seen that happen?
Yeah, no, I actually definitely have. Sorry, I was kind of waiting to see if LB was going to jump in there. Yeah,
sorry.
I have actually seen it on either side, where the submissive is doing it intentionally and the dominant has no idea what's going on. I've seen where the dominant doesn't really see it, and the submissive doesn't realize that she's doing it. So, I've seen several different variations.
LB?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm guilty of it. I talk from the bottom all the time. So, and a lot of it is because it probably is pretty common in relationships that are, when the couple goes into the scene, as newbies. And so somebody had told me, a friend of mine had said, a lot of times when one person gets involved with the BDSM lifestyle, they kind of hope the other partner will come along. So as a submissive, I sort of led the way into the whole scene, and I couldn't really say, well, hey, do you want to do some BDSM stuff? And my husband would, sure, okay, well, I'm going to be the submissive and you be the dominant, so you figure it out. That's not how it happens. So most of what I tell him is just, I don't necessarily tell him what to do, but I tell him what my kinks are, and it's not usually while we're playing, but, I have done that before, but it's, for me personally, it's not something that I want to do. I'm not comfortable doing it, but at the same time, I feel like I have to sometimes.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit also about the role of a brat in these kinds of dynamics or these relationships. And for our audience, there are lots of different definitions of a brat. Tell you what, I'm going to let Lolly start off again with your definition of a brat.
Probably the best choice, considering I am a brat. While I am a submissive and I am very service-oriented, I also enjoy playing the brat role, which is essentially just somebody who likes pushing buttons, in my opinion. You're not necessarily, I should say, I'm not necessarily out to cause problems, but I like innocent mischief, just like another level of dynamic. And, of course, it's always fun to do harmless things that earn yourself a spanking, because, why not?
All right, LB, what's your definition of a brat?
Well, I don't know if I can define it in so many words, but I think of a brat as pretty much what Lolly said, but also for me personally, if I've ever been bratty, it's been more of testing. I've probably guilty of testing my husband at times and just to see what he will do. And so that's sort of probably a part of my bratty nature if I am like that. But I guess, someone who's just testing limits or testing boundaries and maybe resisting a little bit or resisting taking orders and that sort of thing.
I think you have to make a distinction between people who are brats from time to time versus somebody who makes it an integral part of their relationship dynamic. In other words, that relationship just wouldn't work if you weren't acting that way for whatever reason. Maybe your dominant wants you to act that way, or maybe that's the only way you can get any satisfaction or enjoyment out of the relationship. So I think the first thing you have to do is look at the person or the relationship dynamic and say, okay, is this a hardwired part of the relationship dynamic, or is this just something that everyone does from time to time? Everyone's a brat from time to time. I think the question is, does it define the relationship? So, for example, Lolly, you say you're a brat. Does it define your relationship? I mean, could you have a relationship with somebody that you weren't always pushing their buttons and always testing your limits?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, before very recently, I was non-bratty always. I've been a slave most of my life, in fact. So it's definitely not a necessity. I just find it more fun.
I think generally brats, when we think of them, we think of people who are generally well-behaved, but from time to time they've made misbehavior and teasing, pushing buttons, testing limits, defiance, limited defiance and disobedience, those sorts of behaviors, a part of the relationship dynamic. And here's where it gets tricky, because sometimes it happens with the full awareness of the dominant, and sometimes it doesn't. What do you got to say about that, LB?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think that I was aware of what I was doing, and I'm certain that my husband was not aware, and probably in a lot of ways still isn't. But he's a lot more perceptive. I don't mean to make him sound like he's clueless, because he's not, but I know for a fact that he's probably been topped on a number of occasions without realizing what was going on.
I've been in relationships with brats. They were very short-lived relationships for the most part, not because I have a real problem with brats. The problem was that they couldn't differentiate between being a brat and just being a bad submissive. Does that make sense, Lolly?
Yeah, definitely. It's always kind of a fine line that a brat is towing, and it's really kind of why I brought up the harmless mischief, because there's a big difference between somebody who's just outright being disobedient and somebody who's kind of pushing buttons and feeling out the waters a little bit.
Right. All right. Well, folks, we're listening to Domination Submission Radio. I'm Mike Mackay. I have L.B. Shaw and Lolita Sin in studio with me, and we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about how and when and why this sometimes works for people. Be right back. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio. I'm Mike Mackay. My co-host is L.B. Shaw, and our regular contributor is Lolita Sin. And we are talking about topping from the bottom. And we just got done discussing the role of a brat in these relationships and defining what a brat is. Lolly, you say you're a brat. Has there ever been times in your relationships in the past where being a brat has caused major problems for your relationship dynamic?
Not really. Being a brat in a relationship is still fairly new for me, and I'm very careful in how I brat and when I brat. So, as of yet, fingers crossed, knock on wood, it has not been a problem.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've seen, in my past relationships, I have seen situations where people used that as an excuse for absolute, non-negotiable, defined behaviors. Have you seen that, where somebody is actually just really bad at being a submissive, but of course they write it off as, well, I'm not a bad submissive, I'm just a brat?
I've definitely seen that. It's not as common, I don't think, at least not in my experience. You know, when somebody is just blatantly bad at submitting or just doesn't want to submit, it's pretty apparent, even if they name it brattiness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, let me ask this question a different way, and we'll try and get LB on this topic. I think we're having some feedback issues with her mic, but I'll ask this to you again, Lolly. Have you seen situations where the role of a brat, as it pertains to topping from the bottom, has sabotaged a relationship completely?
That's a really good question. Again, personally, I haven't really seen that as much. Most of the people that I interact with, though, are along like the more serious MS style people, and they're not quite on the brat level. So when disobedience in any light is shown, it is stricken down with the mightiest of force. So unfortunately, I'm kind of a bad person to ask about that, I guess.
Now, for our listeners, an MS dynamic is master-slave dynamic, just in case you haven't heard that particular acronym before. In this lifestyle, we tend to divide relationship dynamics up into either master-slave dynamics or dominant-submissive dynamics, and there's really not a whole lot of difference other than the intensity of the illusion of non-consent. Would you say that's probably a good description of the difference?
Oh, yeah, definitely. MS is generally seen as the more hardcore version, where the submissive type really, truly, quote-unquote, doesn't have a say in the matter, whereas a submissive in a DS relationship, there's a little bit more play there.
Mm-hmm. Personally, I think that a lot of the nuances in these kinds of relationships and the problems that occur in these relationships, and we're talking primarily about relationships where there's topping from the bottom, and there are times when it works, and there are times when it doesn't work in a relationship. And in any relationship I'm in, it doesn't work. But there are relationships where it does work. Are you back, LB? You want to address this question?
I'm here. My answer to that question is that I would think that there are times that it does work, and I think it just depends on the couple and whether or not they're both comfortable with that sort of situation. I guess I keep straying to more of a service top thing, but I think that's sort of an inverse of topping from the bottom, because for the service top, they want to be given directives and they want to be told, or the dominant, I should say, wants to be told what to do. So in that sense,
I don't think there's really any distinction there. Service top is just somebody who is acting in a dominant role at the direction of a submissive, and it really doesn't matter whether he wants to or not. He either is or he isn't. So It's kind of like being a top or a bottom. It doesn't really depend at all on whether you want to be a top. If you're the one swinging the whip, you're a top, plain and simple.
Right.
How much you want to be doing that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. But you're right. It is kind of the mirror image. Topping from the bottom is the dynamic where the submissive is telling the dominant what to do, but a service top is what he becomes when that happens, whether he knows it or not.
Sure, and I think that it works okay if like I said, if the couple is okay with it, but I think probably a majority of the time it's an indication that I see it as happening, probably being more likely to happen when the submissive just really needs the dominant to take control, and maybe the dominant isn't, and he or she is just giving direction because they need that control exerted on them. That's kind of how I see it. It's kind of more of a blanketed approach or a stereotype maybe, but that's just sort of how I see it.
Well, Lolly was just saying that she doesn't see it as a successful strategy in a master-slave type of relationship dynamic, and I can see that because no one in a master-slave relationship wants to believe that the dominant isn't really in charge.
Right.
But in a dominant-submissive relationship dynamic, I think you have a lot more wiggle room there, and I think people utilize that wiggle room to go as far as they possibly can to, like Lolly said, to get what you want out of the relationship. I do think that sometimes the problems that do occur in these relationships happen when two people have two different expectations of what is and what isn't going to work. Would you say that's probably a good way to put it, Lolly?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, when topping from the bottom occurs in the context that you're defining it, it's when the dominant has one particular idea about what's supposed to happen, and the submissive says, well, that doesn't quite work for me. How about let's try something else? Obviously, you know, in slightly more underhanded terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, I'm one of those people who is just really, really opposed to any attempt to top from the bottom when it comes to me. I don't mind a little teasing. I don't mind a little pushing my buttons from time to time, but the minute I feel, I'm one of those people that I do the exact opposite of what somebody wants me to do, the minute I realize that they're trying to manipulate me into doing something. And it just drives people absolutely crazy. In fact, it literally infuriates them sometimes because it's always worked before. It's something that they've done in all their relationships before, so they don't understand why it doesn't work in a relationship with me. And part of that is I am just so bullheaded about these things. I'm so stubborn about these things that the minute I get the idea that you're trying to get me to turn right here at this intersection, I will turn left just because you wanted me to go right. And it makes people absolutely
You're an
crazy.
anti-brat?
I'm an anti-brat, yeah. No, not really. I mean, I like brats to a certain degree. I mean, to the point where it's done in fun, I have no problem with that because I can be a brat right back. I can be a dom brat. Ask anyone who's ever interacted with me in real life. I am a dom brat. You know, I tease and I poke fun at people and I deliberately push people's buttons. I'm a provocateur. But when it comes right down to the real deal, when you are trying to get me to do something important, or you're trying to get me to buy you something, or you're trying to get me to admit something or do something or feel something, you know, I've even written a little thing that I wrote in a snit one day, and I'll just read a couple lines. I was really angry about this, that somebody was telling me how I should feel about things. I'm going like, you know what? Don't tell me how I should feel. Don't manipulate me. Don't be condescending. Don't tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. Don't lay a guilt trip on me. Don't try to get me to admit that I'm wrong. Don't go out of your way to try to get me to apologize. I am literally just so bullheaded. I'm worse than a mule, because a mule will just stand there while you're pulling on him to try and get him to go in this direction. I will go in the opposite direction. No matter which way I'm being pulled, I will go in the opposite direction. And it's just an instinct for me. I don't even have to think about it. It's just my natural reaction to being pushed or pulled or prodded or told what to think or what to do or what to say. And it is probably the hardest thing about me to understand for anybody that I'm ever involved with, because it literally makes them crazy. It drives people to tears because they have never met anybody as bullheaded as I am, probably in their entire lives, and they really don't know what to make of it. Have you ever met anyone like that, LB?
Yeah, it sounds like my dad. No offense. My dad's a really awesome person, so...
I realize how tough it is for people to deal with that, but it's particularly tough for someone who doesn't know any other way to be in a relationship, someone who's done this all of their lives, and it's always worked for them before. You know what I'm talking about? It's just those.
Yeah, I think there's lots of people like that aren't in a DS relationship. There are lots of people who are set in their ways, and it can cause problems in lots of areas, but...
Yeah, and this is particularly tough when you have people who are new to the lifestyle, and particularly novice submissives who are kind of feeling their way through the role, and they only really understand what's worked for them in their past vanilla relationships. And now they're in a DS relationship, and they don't realize just what it means to be a dominant. And really what it means is a dominant doesn't like anybody else telling him what to do. I mean, just plain and simple. It's pretty uncomplicated. But the problem is people don't realize that that's what they're doing. When somebody says, oh, you should be more compassionate, you should care about this, you should try to understand how I feel, and I'm going like, you should stop telling me what to think and how to feel. And of course, that's not good. It never ends well when I get rude and mean like that, but it's exactly what I'm thinking, because somebody's telling me what to think and what to feel and how to be, and drives me crazy, and then consequently I spread that around to them. We are going to talk about times where this actually does work, but we're going to take another quick break. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio. I'm Mike Mackay. My co-host is LB Shaw, and our special guest is Lolita Sin. And we'll be back in about 1 minute and 40 seconds. Back. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio, and we're talking about topping from the bottom. In case you missed the definition of that in the first part of the show, topping from the bottom is when a submissive is actually pulling the strings and controlling the decision-making processes of his or her dominant. And so sometimes that's a problem, sometimes it's not a problem. Now we're going to talk about when it's not a problem. We're going to talk about when everyone knows it's going on. The dominant knows it's going on, the submissive knows it's going on, and it's working for them. Have you seen relationships where this is a big part of their dynamic and it actually works really well for them, Lolly?
Yeah, I've actually participated in situations like this before, where I think I've mentioned before, where the dominant person is really not very experienced and the submissive person is quite a bit more or even just slightly more experienced. And the way that the teaching works out, it's kind of a topping from the bottom situation. The dominant sort of tries out what they think works, and the submissive kind of pokes and prods where things could be better, I guess.
I think that this happens a lot more than people will admit to, and I think it happens behind closed doors quite a bit. Obviously, dominant, we have big egos. We don't like to admit that we may not actually be in charge or be able to control our environment or actually know as much as we should and those sorts of things. I mean, those are all little chinks in our dominant armor, and we don't like to show that to everyone out there. But I think there are a lot of relationships where the submissive has a lot more say in the relationship than you or I might assume, given their outward presentation to the public and that sort of thing. So it usually boils down to whatever makes them happy and whatever actually works in their relationship versus what people think about it. But, there are times where things look like it's a topping from the bottom situation when they actually might not be. I'll give you one example. One of the things that I like to do and have always done with my submissives is to give them increasing levels of responsibility and push their limits in terms of what they think they're capable of doing in all sorts of different areas. For example, if somebody is afraid to talk to other people, I might make her greet people as they come in the door at an event. Not just to be mean, but because this is an area where I think she can grow and develop some self-confidence and that sort of thing. And so, but there are also times where I'll delegate authority to do the same thing, to train somebody to become more assertive or to become more, in control of their finances or that sort of thing. And to other people on the outside, they might look at that and go, oh, well, she's really actually in charge of this, or she's actually, taking the reins on this particular project, and wrongly assume that she's in charge. Make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that I think sometimes the dynamic isn't apparent to people on the outside looking in. They only see the activities that are going on. So if they're looking at one of my submissives doing very aggressive, take charge kinds of things, it might be because I put her in charge of something. Usually that's a very stressful, near traumatic event for a lot of submissives. They just don't want to be put in charge of things like that anyway. They prefer, at least in their relationship dynamic, they prefer to kind of hang back and be invisible. But then again, there are those relationships where people are actively trying to influence the decision-making processes of their dominance, and it rarely works out well when it's not appreciated. What do you think some of the consequences of that would be, LB?
Frustration. I think it's really easy for the dominant to get frustrated if that's not the position they want to be put in, and the same with the submissive.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Lolly?
I had a little bit of a brain fart there. Can you just repeat the question?
What are the consequences?
It's been a long day.
Tell me about it. What are the consequences of a situation, a relationship dynamic where the topping from the bottom efforts or strategies being employed by a submissive are just not appreciated by the dominant?
This one I definitely have experience with. Loss of respect. And this may not seem as apparent as some of the others, but essentially the submissive, if they're capable of topping from the bottom, kind of similar to how a brat might test the waters, a submissive might try to top from the bottom just to see if the dominant is even capable of taking control. And if nothing is done to meet the resistance or meet the topping from the bottom or the manipulation or whatever you want to call it, the submissive might just lose all respect, and essentially the DS dynamic would dissolve at that point. Because what is a DS dynamic if not respect?
Absolutely. In fact, that is all of it. It really is. I mean, there are a lot of other little aspects that you can toss in there, but without the respect, none of that matters. And I've got a little bit of experience with a relationship dynamic that didn't work as a result of this sort of thing. Actually, a couple experiences with it. And it never fails to astonish me that it isn't apparent to the person sometimes that is doing it. They don't realize just how serious it is when you show that you no longer respect or trust or believe you're dominant, well then what else is there? There's no basis to even continue the discussion, much less the relationship. And it can be pretty traumatic, I think, for people to realize it, and it sneaks up on you. You know, you don't see it coming. It's not like that light at the end of the tunnel who gets closer and closer and closer, and soon you realize it's a train coming your way. It's something that just sneaks up on you and surprises the crap out of you, because one day you wake up and you realize, I don't respect that person anymore. I don't believe that person anymore. That person is not my dominant anymore. I'm his dominant. You know, you wake up one day someplace you didn't want to be, which is in charge if you're a submissive, for example. But it's a path that they were on all along. You could see it. Anyone from the outside usually can see it. It's not like you just woke up one day and suddenly decided to test the waters and push the buttons and be disobedient and tell him what to do and tell him what to think and tell him he's wrong and ask him why he can't be like all those other dominants. You know what I mean? It doesn't happen overnight. This is a process that happens over a long period of time. And it's unfortunate that the realization that it can be so damaging to a relationship that's built on domination and submission. The relationship dynamic depends entirely on those roles being pretty well defined. You know, if we're talking DS, it's a relationship. BDSM, that's something else entirely. I mean, that's your activities. You know, that's your play. You can be a submissive your entire life and decide, okay, I'm going to see how much fun it is to learn how to use a whip. Okay, that doesn't tinker with your relationship dynamic. That's just changing your mode of play a little bit. What do you think, LB?
Yeah, and I was actually going to say that there's obviously a clear distinction between the playing part of it and the whole relationship dynamic, because sometimes there isn't a DS relationship to start with, and so how do you deal with that when both partners want to explore that, and the submissive is kind of leading the way? I guess we can get caught up in semantics and stuff, but it seems like it can easily get very complicated, and unless there's a lot of communication and, like Lolly said, respect. I mean, that was a really, really good point that she made, because I hadn't really even thought about that, but it's true. And if you're expecting someone to be something that they're falling through and they're not being that person that you expect them to be, then that's very disappointing, and ultimately I can see where you would lose respect for the other person. But I guess I'm kind of going off on a tangent here.
No, it's a very relevant point there, and you're right. Lolly's point that it all boils down to respect is very, very applicable.
Mm-hmm.
Lolly,
Sure.
Anything else on this?
No, I pretty much covered everything I could talk about with that.
Well, probably the most heartbreaking relationship I've ever been in, one of the most heartbreaking relationships I've ever been in, fell apart for this exact reason. It really boiled down, and it was a slow erosion, I think, of respect over the long term. And it was so damaging to the relationship. And it sabotaged the dynamics so badly that I couldn't even continue the conversation. Literally, I couldn't. It was one of those deals where, and I write about it in my book, and so you'll have to get the book and read it if you want to, the whole story. But basically, it was a relationship that I had been in with for a long time, a poly relationship, and the poly dynamic is always going to be much more complex. But the fact that it's more complex doesn't necessarily mean that the dynamic is any different. And the problem was that one submissive was expecting me to fix another submissive. And
Wow.
The problem is you don't just fix people. When people, like I've said in previous shows, one of the worst reasons to get into one of these relationships or to get into the lifestyle at all is to do it expecting someone to fix you, because only one person can fix you, and that's you. All right? And but the second worst thing is expecting someone to fix somebody else. And this is kind of what it boiled down to is, she was saying, well, why can't you just make her feel this way? Well, you can't make anyone feel anything. And you just have to be patient, and you just have to work with people, and you have to be there for them, and you have to, when they invite you into their little bubble, then you should be ready to be invited in. But you can't force your way. You can't break in. and expect to be welcomed with open arms. I'm speaking kind of as an analogy, but you can't break into their emotional bubble anyway without being accepted as a thief, as a burglar, So in the end, she lost faith in me. She lost respect for me because I wasn't willing to go fix somebody else in this particular fashion, at least not in the way she wanted it to happen. She wanted it to happen like, before lunch sort of thing, and these things take time. We literally were at a point where I was saying, you just have to trust me that I am working on these issues, and these things take time. And she came back with something that she just will probably has always regretted saying, but she blurted it out. And once you say it, you can't unsay it, and that's just the point, Master. I don't trust you. I don't believe you.
Ooh.
And I said, well, then we're done here. Bye-bye. And I walked out, and those were the last 2 words I ever said to her. Bye-bye. Because once you get to that point, there's nothing more to be said, at least in my world. In my relationship dynamic, if you don't trust me, you don't believe me, there's the door. That's just the way I roll, and maybe that's cruel, maybe that's harsh. I've been called harsh before, but these relationships are built on those principles: trust, respect. If you don't trust me, you don't respect me, I don't even want to consider you a friend, much less a life partner. Does that sound harsh, Lolly?
No, I actually think that sounds entirely reasonable. I mean, like I said, the entire basis of these types of relationships are respect and trust. I mean, what is submission if you can't trust your dominant to take control? You are, by definition, giving up your control to another person. Of course you have to trust them. Of course you have to respect them. If you don't, you are living a lie. Plain and simple.
Yeah, it's very tough to explain the intensity of that kind of dynamic and the importance of those things to somebody outside the lifestyle. Because, when you're in a vanilla relationship, when somebody says, oh, I trust my husband, I trust my wife, or something like that, what they really mean is, I trust them not to go find another partner and replace me, usually, right? But
that's been my experience.
In a DS relationship, when somebody says they trust you, what they really should be thinking, at least in my mind, is I trust you to make the right decisions. I trust you to do the right thing. I trust you to know what's best for me. It's a completely different thing. We are going to take another quick break, and when we get back, we're going to wrap this up, discuss your questions and your comments, and see what you have to say on this subject. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio. I'm Mike Mackay. My co-host is L.B. Shaw, and our guest is Lolita Sin. We'll be back in just one moment. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio. I'm Mike Mackay. My co-host is L.B. Shaw, and our special guest is Lolita Sin. And we've been talking about topping from the bottom and brats. And speaking of brats, I have on the line Little Red. How are you doing, Red?
I am doing wonderfully, sweetie. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. We were hoping to get you on last week. You're late.
I know, and I apologize profusely, and I told you I will call in every week for a month because I feel so guilty about missing the switch.
Not only do you have to call in every week, you got to do it naked.
Oh, really? Oh, that's just cruel. Because there's nothing for me to do while I'm on the phone if I'm naked.
Cruel is my middle name. So did you have
There's nothing I can do on the radio anyway. The topping from the bottom, sometimes it's acceptable because some of your partners don't understand your dynamics and what you need. And you, depending on how long you've played together, how long they've been in the scene, how long you've been in the scene, I mean, it's a lot of the dynamic, and sometimes you come across somebody and they have an interesting skill, like striping, for example.
That would be me.
And you've never done a scene with them before. And sometimes it can go in a direction you're not completely comfortable with if it's a spur-of-the-moment thing.
Right.
But with your partner, if you're truly partners, then topping from the bottom should never be an issue.
As long as everyone understands what's going on and they agree to it. Personally, I would never agree to giving up that kind of power in my dynamic. It's just not in me. I'm just too hardwired to maintain. You know, I will delegate that, but don't ever try to take it from me. You know what I mean? Have you run up against that?
You know me being bratty and the way I am and a switch for the most part. I can give up control for a small amount of time. I can give up control to my partner for a great deal of time. But I can't do it totally. That's just not in me.
Right. Well, I appreciate you calling in, Red. You remember, you got to call in every week.
I promise. I will call in by at least 7:30 next time. I looked at my watch, and I was like, oh, my God, he's going to be so mad at me.
Well, I'm glad you called in. We'll talk to you next time. Thanks much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, we are kind of getting to the end of our show this evening. You got any parting thoughts on this, Lolly?
I don't know, just, top responsibly, bottom responsibly. Don't be a manipulative jerk, and you'll have fun.
Well spoken. How about you, Albie?
That sounds good to me. I was just going to say I think both parties really need to understand, and it's probably very, very common for new people who are new to the lifestyle, new to the scene, as long as they make it a priority to educate themselves and communicate and all that good stuff.
I think you're absolutely right on that. And you're right. This is a problem that really does crop up most often with people who are brand new to the lifestyle, don't quite understand the nuances, and sometimes they don't quite grasp the differences between DS and BDSM. DS is the relationship dynamic. This is somebody that you are in a relationship with, and it doesn't necessarily have to be romantic, but this person makes a big difference in your real life. That's a relationship. If they don't make a big difference in your real life, that's not a relationship. That's a hobby, or it's entertainment or something. But if your real life is impacted significantly by that person, then that's a relationship. On the other hand, BDSM is mostly play. It's activity. It's what you do. And you can be a dominant and still like to be spanked because you like the sensations. And so you can be a dominant and a bottom. You can be a submissive and a top. So as long as you understand which you are and where you and your partner are trying to go and how to get there, you shouldn't have a problem. The main thing is both of you should have the same understanding of how to get from here to there. You've been listening to DS Radio. I'm Mike Mackay, L.B. Shaw, and Lolita Sin. We all want you back next week, so take care. Have a great day.